told your friend you're not okay. And tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. And guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a smile until I look away. But I've known you too long, it hurts to watch your blue eyes fade to gray as you fade away, as you fade away.
Yeah, I'm about to fade away, cause every time I wake up I feel like it's Monday. Something's going wrong with all the chemicals up in my brain. All of a sudden I don't look at anything the same way. Gotta build up of my thoughts sitting in an ashtray. I'm sorry that I'm so inconvenient, okay. Just let me be me and I'll stay out of your way. I can see the way you look at me, I'm such a disgrace. I never really asked to be brought into this place.
Welcome friends, in this episode we are replacing a damaged rear bumper and tow hitch with a new one from SVC Offroad. If you watch my tire carrier episode, you know that I intended to build my own rear bumper later this year, but those plans fell apart when I got into an accident and ended up deciding to just buy one instead of taking the time to design and make one myself. I've been staring at an SVC Mojave plate bumper for a while, but when I emailed SVC to ask about the towing capacity, they said that the Baja rear bumper, which is still listed and pictured on their website as a V1, actually now accommodates parking sensors and spare tire access similar to their Gen 3 Baja bumper. Having a two bumper on the rear allows me to use, or make a matching tubing front bumper and rock sliders whenever I get around to that. So I jumped on it. It took 3 weeks for the bumper to arrive, and I almost immediately opened it up to check it out. Step 1 for removing the bumper is probably dropping the spare tire, but since mine was already gone, I started disconnecting all of the wiring, beginning with the ground, which is bolted into the frame on the outside of the driver's side. I used a 10mm socket and ratchet to remove this bolt, which holds on the two grounding wires running to the rear bumper. Inside of the driver's side frame horn, you will see 3 connectors, 2 on the side and 1 on top of the subframe. I ended up disconnecting the 2 on the side before realizing that I only needed to remove the 1 on top, and then use a rivet puller to remove the extra clips which secure the wire. Once that was done, I plugged the other 2 wires back in. I thought I'd be able to remove the bumper with the rear exhaust support, so I attached zip ties to the rear exhaust hangers and then up to the bed reinforcement before removing the spare tire safety wire using a 15mm socket and ratchet. Next, I loosened the bumper bolt nuts using a 21mm deep socket and then pulled them off completely, expecting to be able to remove the bumper. But the bumper wouldn't budge because of those exhaust hangers. So I had to grab a 10mm deep socket to unbolt the hanger brackets from the rear bumper.
I know you told your friend you're not okay. And tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt.
Once the old bumper was off, I hammered out the bolt brackets and reused the retaining washers to reinstall the bolt brackets onto the new bumper just for fitment and marking. I lifted the bumper as high as possible and marked the locations on the frame horns and the bed sides where I was going to cut. I did the final marking on the frame horns, removed the exhaust hanger bracket, and started cutting using my bandsaw. I didn't want to remove the exhaust, but I needed to remove it to cut the bed sides anyway, so it would have been better just to do it now. I ended up having issues cutting with the bandsaw, and it would have been easier if the exhaust was disconnected first. I figured that the bed sides needed to be cut from top to bottom and rear to front, so the exhaust had to go. I loosened the straps using a 15mm socket and impact, pried up the safety tabs with a small flathead screwdriver, and removed the hanger bracket bolts using a 10mm socket and impact gun. The carbon and rust buildup between the pipes was substantial, so it took some effort to actually remove the passenger side tailpipe. The driver's side is longer and heavier, so the leverage made it a little easier to rotate and remove. Now that the exhaust was gone, I finished cutting and sanding the frame horns before moving on to the bed sides. Again, there are no directions on how to do this, so I went to their website and guessed where to cut based on looking at the pictures, trying to keep as many of the plastic trim clips intact as possible, and also retaining the rivets that connect the bedside to the tail. I think that if you buy the dovetail covers that they sell, then you'll have a better idea of exactly where to cut. I got pretty frustrated trying to cut the bed with the bandsaw and then the angle grinder before finally using the jigsaw from the bottom to the top. Of course, I completely forgot to tape the trim to prevent damage from the saw, so there ended up being some scratches on there. If I were to do this again, I'd remove the fender, mud flap, and plastic trim and then cut the bed first before cutting the trim to match. Anyway, I finished cutting, sanded everything down to look clean, and then I painted the bare frame horn metal. Now that the truck was prepped, I moved over to the bumpers and set them up next to each other for a direct swap of parts. I pulled out the spare tire keyhole, the trailer towing connector, and the wiring harness before pulling out each sensor one at a time, placing them next to the appropriate hole in the new bumper. The little plastic sensor surrounds can be damaged easily during disassembly, so I had to be careful. But it definitely would have helped, I think, to have an extra set line around. Maybe order some of them before doing it next time. I did install the sensors in the new bumper, and 3 of them were a direct fit. So there's a special cutout that they have, and they did have the appropriate guide cutouts for 3 of them. But the 4th one was it was way off. I'm not sure that it's a year model issue or if they just had the wrong CAD model for that cutout. Anyway, I reconnected the harness and tried to get fancy with the license plate wiring by splicing in a connector to the shorter lighting connector on the harness, and then I taped up the longer connector before realizing that I had to get clever with how to wrap up the harness length and reuse the securing clips. There are holes in the new bumper where the plastic push rivets go in, but I had to move them around a bit on the wiring harness to get it right. Now it was time for install, so I threw it on using the old bracket retaining clips on the new larger bolts. I pushed it up as far as possible, but realized that the bumper wasn't parallel to the tailgate. And it wasn't a frame issue from the accident or anything like that. The frame horns were level, the holes were level and uniform, and along with the tailgate. But it was the new bumper holes were about a 1/4 inch different in height on the bumper itself. So I had to adjust the height, and I used a square to measure the difference side to side, since the truck itself wasn't actually on a level surface, so a level wouldn't have helped. So next I reconnected all of the wiring, including the ground on the outside of the driver's side frame. I plugged in the license plate light pigtail and turned on the lights in the truck to verify the polarity of the wire colors and to make sure that all the LEDs were working in that license plate light. So I'm an idiot, and I didn't verify that the light connector actually fit through the wiring hole, which it didn't, so I needed to splice it together on the truck. But when I went to bolt the light into the bumper, I found that the threads were powder coated, and after destroying a couple of bolts, I ended up just retapping the holes to 1/4 20. Now I could install the light, splice the wires for the lighting, and complete the final torquing on the bumper using a 24mm wrench and socket to torque the bolts to 146 foot-pounds. The torque isn't written anywhere that I could find. I just based the torque off a chart that I found online for grade 10.9 bolts in size M14, which is what came with the new bumper. The stock bolts are grade 10.9 in size M12. So the new ones are larger. The spare tire keyhole cover didn't fit properly because the metal was too thin, so I bought some battery terminal protectors thinking that would make a nice gasket, but the ones I bought were covered in oil, so that was dumb. I ended up cutting out garage door gasket into rings, and it took 3 layers to make enough space to allow the cover to fit properly. The last thing for the bumper proper was to install the SVC tag, but I wanted to paint match as close as possible without special ordering any paint. The Duplicolor Intense Pearl Blue was the closest to AutoZone, so I did 3 coats and 3 clear, allowing a few weeks to pass before installing. So it's all done, right? Well, no. The new bumper doesn't have exhaust hangers. Most people would just cut off the exhaust behind the axle or buy a KHC exhaust dump kit. But I think I can do anything, so I decided to make my own exhaust, because what could go wrong? I removed the old muffler's rear hanger bracket using a 10mm socket extension and an impact gun, and then I loosened the clamps using a 15mm socket and ratchet before unbolting the forward hanger using a 10mm socket and prying up the safety clip using a small flathead. I did have to use some penetrating oil on the clamps before breaking the muffler loose and pulling it out. The resonator has one flange style clamp and a band clamp. The flange requires a 13mm socket to loosen and remove, but the passenger side band clamp needs a 15mm mid-size socket. I found that the 1/2-inch drive ratchet and 15mm socket is actually what's required. The 3/8 inch was too long in deep socket size, and it was too short in a standard socket, which ended up causing me to slip and slice my hand open on the heat shield. My wife wasn't home, so I had to clean up, throw some chalk blocks in front of the truck, and roll it out of the garage in neutral before asking my neighbor to drive me to urgent care. I ended up having to rent a car for the week since the truck was stuck, but I wrapped up the braced hand and kept working to try and get it done as soon as possible. Since I still hadn't purchased the correct tool, I ended up using a pry bar with a 3/8 inch ratchet to loosen the clamp nuts and pull off the resonator. I used my bandsaw to cut the connectors off the resonator before realizing that the pipes forward of the resonator, they weren't 3 inches like the rest of the exhaust. They're actually 2.5. Since I bought 3-inch exhaust piping, resonators, X-pipe, and mufflers, I had to buy some adapters and weld those on to make it work. Due to the short distance required for the cab side exit exhaust, I cut off any extra piping and welded the resonators on. Next, I cut the extra pipe and tacked on the X-pipe before adding the 2 Flowmaster style mufflers back to back. I welded all of that together before adding a hanger using a 1/2-inch rod and moving on to the hard part. The goal was to get all of the piping above the frame using the little notch between where the frame rises and the forward leaf spring bracket sits. I tacked everything together, deciding to have some offset tips vertically and horizontally to match the bedsides and fender, and honestly it was also just because there was no way I was going to get it perfect, so I needed to do something anyway. After making some adjustments to ensure that the tips were straight and the right distance apart, I welded everything together. I did the finish weld, I threw on some exhaust paint, and then I finally installed the exhaust. So, I don't actually know anything about exhaust, if that wasn't already painfully clear. The Flowmaster style mufflers were deafening, even with the single layer of sound deadening I did on all 4 doors and the rear of the cab. I ended up spending even more money buying an 18-inch MagnaFlow muffler to quiet it down and go through the whole headache of basically redoing the exhaust and removing the X-pipe, since the MagnaFlow muffler has an X-pipe kind of built in. So, final thoughts on the bumper are that overall it's great. You really only get 4 more inches of ground clearance, but that's quite a good departure angle with 37-inch tires and upgraded springs. The bumper also retains full capability with lighting, sensors, spare tire access, and a hitch. When I asked SVC what the hitch rating was, they said that it's not officially rated, but some of their customers have reported towing full capacity without issues. So it's kind of a tow at your own peril situation. The bumper also didn't come with any instructions, and when I called SVC to ask for some, they said they they don't have an install manual for this bumper, and they highlighted that you really just need to cut the frame horns and the bed sides and then bolt it on. It's not a concern for me since I did figure it out, but it provides less confidence and it makes the process take longer. The big negative is that you do need to figure out what to do with the exhaust. The bumper hangers in the hangers in the rear don't really hold a lot of weight, if any. And I drove for a week without them on there. They were just hanging. I did add some wire as a safety precaution, but ultimately, you do need to reroute the exhaust or do a dump kit. And KHC does sell a nice dump kit that exits right where the spare tire would be. I originally wanted to do side exit bezels behind the rear tires, but I opted for the cab side exit to try and fit the spare under the bed. And I should have test fit the spare with the exhaust off first to verify, since after all of the trouble of making that exhaust, I found out that the tire still doesn't fit. I don't know how all these people on the forums are claiming that their 37-inch tires fit under the bed, because even with the extra space from the new bumper, the rear spring mounts prevent the tire from fitting. So unless I cut into the leaf spring mounts, there's no way to fit a 36.5-inch tire under there. I do acknowledge that I have an aftermarket diff cover, which takes up maybe an extra half inch, but there's just no way to fit the tire there. The final word on the bumper is that I love it. It looks cool, it's cheaper than stock, and it gives me everything I need. But as far as my exhaust that I made, the new muffler made a substantial improvement, but I'm still going to add some more sound deadening to the truck to make the ride more comfortable for passengers. Ultimately, a cab side exit exhaust is going to be way too loud for most people, and you're going to hate it. Plus, it adds hundreds of dollars to the bumper project. And for me, it added a trip to the ER and a week's worth of rental car expense, so that sucked. As I said in the last video, I've got a drive full of several more videos. I just don't have time to edit them, so I'll get to it when I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.